Orchestrated script framework rotation with thematic conflict narrative. Orchestrated script framework rotation with thematic conflict narrative. Every Sunday morning for 22 years, a man in Calhoun, Georgia, sat on his front porch at 6 o'clock, drank black coffee from a mug that said, "Heritage, not hate," and listened to country radio while the sun came up over a yard he'd mowed in the same diagonal pattern since 1998. And every Sunday morning for 22 years, a man in Cleveland, Ohio, knelt beside his bed at 6 o'clock, clasped his hands together, and prayed the same prayer his mother had taught him when he was 9. Lord, make me useful today. One man's name was Dale Buckner. The other man's name was Steve Harvey. On June 7, 2024, Dale Buckner stood on the Family Feud stage, looked Steve Harvey in the eye in front of 200 people and 14 live cameras, and said, "Why don't you go back to Africa?" Steve Harvey didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't walk off stage. He set his cue cards on the podium, folded his hands, and did something so unexpected that Dale Buckner's own family gasped louder than the audience. 4 hours later, Dale Buckner was sobbing on that same stage, holding a man he'd insulted on national television, and the 7-year-old girl standing between them said 9 words that neither man and neither family would ever be able to forget. It was a Friday taping in Atlanta, hot and bright, the kind of June day that makes the parking lot shimmer. The Buckner family had driven 4 hours from northwest Georgia in a white Ford F-250 with a Confederate flag bumper sticker that a production assistant noticed in the lot and quietly reported to the stage manager, who noted it and moved on. Dale Buckner was 59, retired from a carpet mill in Dalton that had closed in 2019, broad-shouldered, sunburned, with a handshake that could crack a walnut. With him were his wife Linda, his son Kyle, his daughter-in-law Megan, and his granddaughter Sophia, 7 years old, who had her mother Megan's auburn hair and her father Kyle's gray eyes and brown skin. Because Kyle Buckner was biracial. Kyle's biological mother, a black woman named Angela, had a relationship with Dale when Dale was 19 years old. Angela left Calhoun when Kyle was 2. Dale raised Kyle alone. This fact, this enormous, contradictory, buried fact, was the fault line running beneath everything that was about to happen on that stage. On the other side of the bracket, the Robinson family from Birmingham, Alabama, 3 generations deep, anchored by a 71-year-old grandmother named Betty, who had marched in the Children's Crusade in 1963, stood in their family huddle, laughing, loose, and ready. But nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen. Dale Buckner was not a simple man, though he had spent his entire life pretending to be one. He grew up in a house where the word was used at the dinner table like seasoning, casually, constantly, without weight. His father, Earl, had worked the same carpet mill Dale would later work, and held opinions about the world that Dale absorbed the way children absorb weather, without questioning whether it was supposed to be that way. When Dale was 19, and Angela Harris, who worked the second shift at a gas station off I-75, smiled at him across a counter, something cracked in the wall his father had built. They were together for 3 years. Angela was kind. Angela was patient. Angela made Dale laugh in a way no one before or since had managed. When Kyle was born, Dale held his son in the hospital and felt something rearrange inside his chest. Then Earl found out. What followed was not a conversation, but an eviction. Dale was told to choose. He chose his son. Angela, exhausted by the town's stares and Dale's inability to defend her publicly, left when Kyle was 2. Dale never spoke about her again. He raised Kyle in that same house after Earl died, in that same town, surrounded by the same people who had driven Angela away. He loved his son ferociously and silently, the way men love when they've been taught that love is weakness. He never examined the contradiction, loving a biracial child while displaying a bumper sticker, holding his granddaughter Sophia on his lap while repeating phrases he'd learned at a table where the salt shakers sat next to slurs. The contradiction lived inside him like a second heartbeat, and he never once pressed his ear to it and listened. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. Kyle Buckner spent his entire childhood navigating the space between what his father said and who his father loved. He was too brown for Calhoun and too country for Atlanta. He learned early to read rooms, to shrink, to code switch so fast he sometimes forgot which version of himself he'd walked in as. When he married Megan, a white woman from Chattanooga, Dale was relieved in a way that made Kyle's stomach turn. Relieved that Sophia might pass, might not have to carry what Kyle carried. Kyle never confronted his father about any of it. Sophia grew up calling Dale Pop Pop and sitting on his lap on that porch on Sunday mornings, drinking apple juice while Dale drank black coffee, and neither of them knew that the ground beneath them was made of silence, and silence was getting tired of holding. The game started normally. The Buckners were loud, the Robinsons were louder. Betty Robinson, 71, was the crowd favorite immediately. She answered every question with a story first, drove Steve crazy with the clock, and made the audience laugh until they wheezed. Steve was loose, playful, trading jokes with both families. Then, in the third round, the survey question was, "Name something you'd find at a family reunion." Dale buzzed in first. He looked at the board, then at Steve and said, "Good food and people who look like you." The audience laughed. Steve smirked. "Show me people who look like you." It wasn't on the board. Dale lost the point. The Robinsons stole. As Steve moved to their podium, Dale muttered something. It was picked up by the podium microphone, but not clearly. Steve paused. He turned back. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Dale looked at Steve, and something shifted in his face, something old and inherited and ugly, and he said, clearly, into a live microphone, "I said, why don't you go back to Africa?" The studio fell completely silent. 200 people stopped breathing. Linda Buckner's hand flew to her mouth. Kyle closed his eyes, and his chin dropped to his chest. Megan pulled Sophia against her side. Betty Robinson straightened her back and pressed her lips together. Every camera in the studio swiveled between Dale and Steve. The floor director froze. The control room erupted. Producers shouting, the director calling for a cut. Steve's earpiece exploded with voices telling him to go to break, to defuse, to walk away. Steve didn't move. He stood center stage, 6 feet from Dale Buckner, and for 11 seconds he said nothing. He just looked at Dale. Not with anger, not with shock, with something worse, with recognition. Then Steve reached up, pulled out his earpiece, and set it on the podium. He looked at his floor director. "Keep rolling," he said. "Don't cut anything." He walked to Dale's podium. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke quietly enough that the front row had to lean forward. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear me. I'm not going back to Africa. I'm not going anywhere. I've been here. I'm going to stay here. And I'm going to talk to you like a man. Not because you deserve it right now, but because your granddaughter is watching." Dale blinked. For the first time since the words left his mouth, he looked at Sophia. She was staring at him. Not crying, not scared, staring with the particular intensity of a child who has just heard something she cannot fit into her understanding of the world. The audience thought that was the peak. They were wrong. Steve turned to the Robinson family. Betty Robinson was standing perfectly still, arms at her sides, chin high. Steve said, "Miss Betty, I owe you an apology on behalf of this stage." Betty shook her head slowly. "You don't owe me anything, sweetheart. I've heard worse from better." The audience exhaled. Then Betty did something no one expected. She walked across the stage, past Steve, past Kyle, past Megan, and stood directly in front of Dale Buckner. She was 5'2". Dale was 6'1". She looked up at him. "I marched in Birmingham when I was 8 years old," she said. "Dogs, hoses, jail cells. I've been called everything you can think of, and some things you can't. And I'm still here. So whatever you're carrying that makes you talk like that, it's heavy, isn't it? I can see it. It's heavy." Dale's face changed, not softened, crumbled. The wall that Earl Buckner had built in a dining room in Calhoun 40 years ago, the wall Dale had maintained with bumper stickers and muttered phrases and deliberate ignorance, started to crack. And what came through the cracks wasn't hate. It was shame. Raw, staggering, decades-old shame. Dale's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hands started shaking. Kyle stepped forward, and for the first time in his 37 years, he put his hand on his father's shoulder and said, "Dad, it's time." Dale looked at his son, his biracial son, the boy he'd raised alone, the boy he'd loved in silence while parroting the language of people who would have hated that boy. And his legs gave out. He sank to one knee on the Family Feud stage. Megan was crying. Linda was crying. Sophia broke free from her mother's hand and walked to her grandfather. She put both hands on his face, the way children do when they want you to stop looking at anything except them, and she said, "Pop, Pop, why are you so mean to people who look like Daddy?" The studio fell completely silent for the longest stretch of dead air in the show's history. 14 seconds. Steve Harvey turned away from the family, walked to the edge of the stage, pressed his fist against his mouth, and stayed there. A cameraman named Rodney, 12 years on the crew, lowered his camera and didn't pick it back up. The audio engineer in the booth took off his headphones and set them on the console. Producers stopped talking. For 14 seconds, the only sound in that building was Dale Buckner breathing on one knee while his 7-year-old granddaughter held his face and waited for an answer he didn't have. When Steve walked back, his eyes were red. He stood in front of Dale, who was still on one knee, and extended his hand. Dale took it. Steve pulled him to his feet. Then Steve said 5 words, so quietly the boom mic almost missed them. "Hate is just fear talking." Dale nodded. His chin was trembling. Steve kept holding his hand. "Let me tell you something, Dale, and I need everyone in this room to hear this. 21 years ago, I wrote a goodbye letter to my family. I was done. I was broken, and I was empty, and I was sitting in a car I'd been living in for 3 years, and I had decided the world didn't have room for me. And the only reason I'm standing here today is that a stranger walked up to me at 2 in the morning and treated me like I was worth something when I had given him every reason not to. A stranger. That's what saved my life. Not family, not money. A stranger who chose to see me instead of judge me." Steve paused. "Miss Betty just did that for you. She walked across this stage and saw you. After what you said, she saw you. And I'm going to ask you something I've never asked anyone on this show. I'm going to ask you to see her back." Dale turned to Betty. The old woman was standing with her arms at her sides, patient, immovable, the same way she had stood on a street in Birmingham 61 years ago when the world tried to wash her away and she refused to go. Dale looked at her. His mouth moved several times before words came. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've been sorry my whole life, and I didn't know it." Betty nodded. She didn't hug him. She didn't forgive him in some grand, cinematic gesture. She extended her hand, and Dale took it. And they shook hands, firm, equal, deliberate, while 200 people watched and understood that forgiveness is not a feeling, but a choice made in real time by a woman who had earned the right to refuse it and didn't. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled his phone from his jacket. On stage, during a taping, he called Dr. Jerome Williams, the director of the Racial Healing Initiative at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. "I have two families on my stage," Steve said, "one that said the wrong thing and one that did the right thing. I need you to help me build something that makes sure this moment doesn't end when the cameras stop." Dr. Williams said yes. He proposed a community dialogue program, structured conversations between families in divided communities, facilitated by trained mediators, funded by the show. Steve said he'd personally fund the first year. The audience erupted. Dale stood with his head bowed. Kyle was holding Sophia, tears running down his face. Linda had crossed the stage and was standing next to Betty, holding her hand. But Steve wasn't done. He looked at both families. Nobody loses today. Nobody. He awarded the full $20,000 to the Robinson family. Then he turned to the Buckners. "Your family is coming back, not to play the game, to finish what started today. Because this stage isn't just for games. It's for whatever needs to happen." He looked at Kyle. "And your father loves you. He always has. He just didn't have the language. That's not an excuse, but it's a start." Kyle nodded. Sophia, still in his arms, reached one hand toward Betty Robinson. Betty took it. A 7-year-old girl holding a 71-year-old woman's hand across every year between them, across marches and mills and bumper stickers and silence, across everything that should have made them strangers and somehow didn't. Steve walked to the camera. "Everyone watching at home, don't change the channel. Don't scroll. Sit in this. The man who said that ugly thing on my stage today is not a monster. He's a man who was taught wrong and never got taught right. And the woman he said it to chose to see him anyway. That's not weakness. That's the hardest thing a human being can do. So tonight, I need you to think about the thing you were taught that you never questioned. The joke you laugh at that costs someone else something. The word you use when you think nobody's listening. Your granddaughter is always listening. Your son is always watching. Start there." The unedited clip was uploaded by a crew member's phone before the official release. It had 31 million views in 16 hours. When the network posted the full segment, it reached 120 million in 3 days. Within 6 weeks, it crossed 460 million views. The most watched moment in Family Feud's history, and the most shared television clip of 2024. The hashtag #HateIsJustFearTalking trended for 23 days in 91 countries. Betty Robinson was invited to speak at 17 universities. Dale Buckner received 14,000 messages, some angry, some hateful, some threatening, but thousands of them from people who said they recognized themselves in him and were ashamed and wanted to change and didn't know how. The Buckner family did return to Atlanta, not for the show. In August of 2024, Dale and Kyle sat in a room at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights with Betty Robinson and 3 of her grandchildren, and they talked for 4 hours. No cameras, no audience, just 2 families and a mediator and a box of tissues, and a long, imperfect, necessary conversation that didn't fix anything, but started something. Kyle later said in an interview that it was the first time his father had ever spoken aloud about Angela, Kyle's mother, the woman Dale had loved at 19, the woman the town had driven away. Dale said her name. He said he was sorry. He said it 40 years too late and into the wrong room. But he said it. Steve Harvey launched the Sophia's Bridge Foundation in October of 2024, funding it with $2.2 million of his own money. The foundation places trained facilitators in communities across the American South to lead structured racial reconciliation dialogues. Not lectures, not shaming, but conversations modeled on what happened on that stage. A confrontation, a choice, a hand extended. In its first 16 months, the foundation facilitated 1,894 dialogues in 212 communities across 19 states, reaching an estimated 41,000 participants. The foundation's motto, printed on every facilitator's badge, is a 7-year-old girl's question. Why are you so mean to people who look like Daddy? In June of 2026, on the 2nd anniversary of the taping, 2 men sat on a porch in Calhoun, Georgia, at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning. One was 59 years old, sunburned, broad-shouldered, drinking black coffee from a plain white mug. The old one with the bumper sticker slogan had been thrown away 11 months earlier, dropped into a trash can in the driveway by Dale's own hand, while Sophia watched from the front steps and said, "Good job, Pop-Pop." The other man on the porch was Kyle. He was drinking coffee too. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. The yard was mowed in the same diagonal pattern. The country radio was on. The sun was coming up over the same trees it had always come up over. But the porch held 2 people now, where it used to hold 1, and the silence between them was not the old silence, the silence of things buried and swallowed and never said. It was new silence, the kind that comes after the hard thing has finally been spoken, when there's nothing left to hide from, and the morning is just a morning, and the coffee is just coffee, and the man next to you is your son. And you can finally say that out loud and mean all of it. Because a 7-year-old girl didn't ask her grandfather a question. She held a mirror up to a man who had spent his whole life looking away. And she was small enough that he couldn't look over her, and brave enough that he couldn't look past her, and his enough that he couldn't pretend she was talking about someone else. The people who change us are never the ones with the biggest voices. They're the ones with the steadiest eyes. If this story rattled something loose in your chest that you've been keeping bolted down, subscribe to this channel right now. Tap that notification bell. Every single week, we bring you the stories the algorithm buries. The ones about strangers who chose grace when the world gave them every reason to choose anger. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not tomorrow, not later, right now. And if you're the one carrying a word you were taught, a phrase you repeat, a wall you built because someone else handed you the bricks, today is the day you set one down. Just one. That's enough. That's the start.